The situation around the Dolphins on Tuesday carried that strange, quiet electricity that only appears when something minor insists on revealing a deeper pulse. 3 linebackers walked into the facility for tryouts, and there was nothing ordinary about the atmosphere around it. It was the kind of move you glance at once, then realize you should stare again because something underneath refuses to stay hidden. A moment that pretends to be small, but clearly wants to be noticed. And then you start asking yourself, what pushed the team into this exact timing? Was it caution, curiosity, or something the staff prefers to keep wrapped behind vague comments and short answers? The names came straight from the transaction report, untouched and factual. Jimmy Charlo, Cam Riley, KC Osai. Just a list, simple on the surface. But lists like this never carry only names. They carry tension, urgency, and sometimes the outline of a decision that hasn't been publicly explained yet. 3 players stepping into a room where everything feels heavier than it should. You imagine the subtle unease, that mix of routine evaluation and quiet expectation, wondering which one of them might carry the spark the staff believes is missing somewhere in the rotation. And just like that, one name stayed. Charlo earned his place on the practice squad, not loudly, not dramatically, but firmly enough to make the whole situation tilt in his direction. It makes you wonder what exactly the Dolphins saw in him during those hours. Not just effort. Everyone trying out carries effort like armor. Something else. Something the team wanted badly enough to say yes, while letting the other 2 fade back into that uncertain space between opportunity and the next hope. Charlo is 24, an age that sits right at the intersection between belief in what's ahead and awareness of how quickly everything can collapse. He was a 2-year starter at Army, and that alone sets a tone around him. There's a particular weight carried by players who know that football isn't the only duty waiting for them. When his career on the field ends, and every player feels that shadow at some point, he will serve in the infantry. That fact follows him everywhere, almost like an invisible companion standing behind each rep, each mistake, each achievement. It changes the way you look at him. You can almost sense that every play he fights for matters in a way that goes beyond roster spots and game plans. There's something unsettlingly compelling in the way his journey unfolded after the 2024 draft. The Jets picked him up as an undrafted free agent, a lifeline thrown into the uncertainty of his transition from college. But then came the tear, the ACL ripping through his trajectory with a suddenness that always feels unfair, no matter how many times this league sees it happen. One injury, one moment, and suddenly the conversations shift. Instead of discussing where he fits in the scheme, people start wondering if he'll ever get the chance to fit at all. He was cut with an injury designation, leaving behind the quiet frustration of a path interrupted before it even had time to stretch. But the league has its way of keeping track of certain players, the ones who leave impressions that numbers can't explain. And the Bills saw something in him. They brought him in this past August, practically at the edge of preseason chaos, when teams still search for clarity among dozens of bodies, fighting through drills and scrambling for a final chance. He made it through that storm, stuck on the practice squad, not out of luck, but because he convinced someone in that building that he deserved to hold on a little longer. He bounced up and down, shifting between practice squad and the active roster, floating in that strange purgatory that so many fringe players know too well. One moment you're in meetings preparing for Sunday, the next you're back in the uncertainty of a flexible contract. It wears on anyone. Yet he kept pressing forward, not fading, not resigning himself to the background. The Bills let him go earlier this season, and those moments always feel colder than anyone admits. A call, a short conversation, a door closing quietly. But even then, something in his story kept resisting the idea of ending. And now he lands in Miami, a place that never feels neutral. Nothing around the Dolphins stays quiet for long. Even practice squad signings take on energy here, especially when the defense sits under constant scrutiny. Every rotation, every shift, every little hint of evaluation becomes a storyline waiting to erupt. And adding a linebacker at this exact moment feels like one of those subtle shifts that begs for interpretation. Why now? Why him? What did the coaches sense lingering beneath the surface of the current group? Charlo appeared in 2 games for the Bills this season, and those appearances, brief as they seem on paper, carry something meaningful. Getting on the field at all in a league this unforgiving says something. You don't reach that point without convincing a staff that you can survive actual snaps against real competition. He didn't have the luxury of easing into anything. Every moment he stepped onto the field, he carried the weight of proving not only that he belonged, but that he refused to disappear. Maybe that's what tugged the Dolphins in his direction. Not necessarily the production, but the persistence. There's a quality in players who keep resurfacing after setbacks. A kind of stubbornness that teams quietly respect. And if there's one thing the Dolphins' defense has shown it needs at times, it's a spark from someone who doesn't collapse under pressure or hesitation. What complicates everything, and somehow makes it more intriguing, is the timing. Tryouts don't happen by accident. A Tuesday doesn't get filled with evaluations unless there's a question floating through the building. A concern about depth, a desire for new energy, a search for someone who can play with more urgency when the situation demands it. You start to imagine the internal dialogue among the staff. Late-night reviews, hesitations, maybe even arguments about who fits and who doesn't. And then they bring in 3 linebackers, as if trying to give shape to a hunch they don't want to ignore. Riley and Asai walked out without contracts, but that doesn't make their appearance irrelevant. Sometimes the presence of players who don't stay tells an unspoken story about what the Dolphins believed they needed, and what they ultimately decided they couldn't compromise on. Something about Charlo clicked. Something about his movement, his communication, his raw presence. Maybe the coaches saw in him a thread they could pull and weave into the scheme. Maybe they felt he had a steadiness the group lacked, or a certain edge the unit could use more of. It's impossible not to wonder what the Dolphins truly expect from him. A practice squad role is quiet, yes, but in Miami it can turn into something much louder with almost no warning. Injuries happen. Rotations shift. Someone underperforms. Suddenly a player who was learning the terminology on Thursday is stepping onto the field the next weekend, holding the responsibility of a defense that refuses to be ignored. Could Charlo be one of those stories waiting to take shape? Could he be the kind of unexpected spark that teams don't notice until the exact moment they need it? There's also the layer nobody wants to talk about openly. Emotion. Not the dramatic kind, but the personal kind. Charlo's background carries a gravity players feel when they line up beside someone like him. Serving in the infantry after football isn't a footnote. It shapes everything. How he trains, how he prepares, how he fights for every chance. Maybe the Dolphins felt that weight. Maybe they sensed at the moment he stepped onto the field for the tryout, carrying a resolve sharper than anyone else in the room. You can picture how his presence changes the energy in drills. Not because he's loud or flashy, but because he moves like someone who refuses to let uncertainty dictate his future. Someone who knows what's at stake and doesn't ask for sympathy. Someone who keeps showing up because stopping simply isn't an option. And teams pick up on that. Coaches pick up on that. Even players battling for the same spot pick up on that. All of this makes the Dolphins' choice feel less like a filler move and more like an intentional shift. Something controlled, deliberate. A piece being added to a defense that has spent the season balancing flashes of dominance with moments that feel strangely hollow. Could Charlo become the kind of presence that forces the unit to tighten? Could he be one of those small additions that ends up shaping something bigger later? Every season has names that fade into obscurity and names that break through when nobody expects. Which path Charlo will take is unknown, but the Dolphins clearly believe he's worth the next chapter. And that belief, quiet as it seems, can be the beginning of something the team didn't even realize it needed.